And we got to talk about the box office. We got to talk about the state of movie theaters. We got to talk about what's going on here. So we've saved a lot of what we would usually talk about with Mad Max and even Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes for a specific conversation because things look a little bleak, which I don't know if we can be that surprised by because coming into 2024, we already had our reservations about the slate this year and just the lack of major titles. But now it's looking like that's starting to actually take shape over the course of the past few weeks because the box office just isn't in the healthiest place right now compared to last year, years before that. It's struggling right now, and that's really driven by the conversation around Furiosa, that film that came out over Memorial Day weekend, one of the most popular movie-going weekends of the calendar year, just did not do well. Furiosa, Mad Max Saga, brought in $32 million over the long Memorial Day weekend. It was initially projected to bring in about $40 million over the 4 days, so it did not hit that. It only brought in $32 million. And the budget for this film was $168 million, which, take that with a grain of salt. That's probably a conservative estimate. It probably costs a lot more than that, but reportedly that movie cost $168 million. Very, very expensive to only bring in $32 million in its opening weekend. And that ultimately brings us to the lowest box office Memorial Day weekend since Casper in 1995, which brought in $22.5 million over its opening weekend. But not to add insult to injury, but if we're being honest about it and thinking about it in the way that we should, and you adjust for inflation, it doesn't even meet Casper. Casper made in 2024 dollars, made closer to $50 million if you take the raw number and adjust for inflation. And so you would actually have to go back to, I believe, 1981, Bustin' Loose from Richard Pryor, which made in that year $22 million. And I think that would in actuality represent the lowest Memorial Day opening weekend. I believe that's the case. But regardless, 30 years, 40 years, whatever it is, it's a bad look. The lowest opening in 30 years for Memorial Day holiday weekend. It's a really, really tough look. Furiosa only narrowly beat out the Garfield movie, which also made $31 million. And so both studios claimed number one at the box office. It did bring in an additional $33.3 million from the international box office. And after that opening weekend, it was standing at about $58 million globally. Now it's crossed 100 million now in its second weekend. But at that time, again, 58 million for a movie that cost $116 million. Very problematic. The last movie, Fury Road, which had Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron, that earned $65 million when it opened in a very similar time frame. So we see the decreases there. And it's also significantly down from last year when The Little Mermaid opened to $118 million from Disney during Memorial Day. And the year before that, Top Gun Maverick launched with $160 million over the Memorial Day weekend. So again, you can see the business that Memorial Day typically does, just not repeated here. It's just not the case. We don't have a really huge crossover tentpole movie to replicate those numbers. But not only that, I mean, it's not just Furiosa. It's other movies that are struggling too. The Fall Guy struggled out of the gate. It only debuted to 27.7 million. Projections for that film were between 30 and 35, so it did not hit that. In its second weekend, it only made 13.7 million, so it dropped off 51%. And ultimately, it's grossed about $147 million worldwide so far. And the budget for that film is closer to the edge of 150 million. So again, another extremely expensive movie, underperforming vastly. And so if you look at the domestic box office as of this recording, it's down 24.5% compared to last year, and it's down 43% compared to 2019. So it's hurting. It's definitely hurting. Some of this was to be expected, again, just due to the lack of big budget tentpole blockbusters that we would traditionally see by this time. But this is definitely an alarming stat and I think a concerning sign for movie theaters. As we just open up this conversation, man, what's your initial reaction to just everything that's happening right now? It felt like the beginning of the year, we had a little bit of momentum. Things were looking decent with Doom Part 2 and Godzilla. Those were performing pretty well. And now as we get into the deep summer season, where it's supposed to be bringing in the most money for the year, it's just missing pretty much on all fronts. And so what's your reaction to all this?
Oh, man, so many thoughts. One thing is, of course, being afraid for movie theaters. We'll talk about that in depth, but also part of me is afraid for the state of action films, just in general, not maybe like them even being made. Because if there's a long list of history and projections in these movies, action films that are coming out, and you tell me like 2 out of 10 have made money, how can you as a studio then say, oh, I'll greenlight this action movie? Absolutely. Big budget, let's do it. Now I'm afraid that some of these may never happen. And, and that, action movies may not necessarily die off completely, right? Because we're always going to have our low budget action films. There's always going to be people out there who want to make action movies for sure. But the blockbusters, I'm afraid for the blockbusters. I'm afraid for the movies that that we know that we can go in and you're like, wow, I would have never seen this crazy action scene anywhere else but here on IMAX with this over $120 million budget. You know what I mean? Like, I'm afraid for some of those things happening in the future, because man, yeah, that's one of my thoughts for sure. My other thought is, why completely or do people not want to go see action films? And I think that's a very basic question, right? It's like, why? And I remember asking this question on Twitter actually, but somebody was like, I don't think action movies are as good as they used to be. And I think as people who watch films, watch a lot of these movies, these blockbusters, I can't necessarily 100% agree with that either. Like, Furiosa is a banger, you know what I'm saying? Like, Top Gun was a banger. I like Fall Guy. Don't get me wrong, it's not the best movie ever, but I really like Fall Guy. I don't think it deserved that either. So it's like, I'm just trying to find, I think, the middle ground with all of this and then why this is happening. And I'm trying to ask people like, how do you feel about action movies? Because this is not only alarming for, it's alarming for the rest of the summer now. What is Bad Boys comes out this week? What is Bad Boys going to do? That's fits the same vein as a lot of this. It is an action film. It is higher budget. So what does that mean for Bad Boys? What does that mean for whatever else is to come out for the rest of this year, but nevertheless this summer? But that's all. Those are my initial reactions. It was just like, what is going on? And when it comes to people, when it comes to our peers, and it comes, why aren't they going to see some of these movies? Those are some of my biggest questions.
So I don't think it's an action or genre thing at all. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think there's obviously a lot of factors. We actually talked about
Absolutely.
many of these factors with the Fall Guy too, just based on the premise and the unknown IP, the title,
Yeah, the
of
marketing,
the
title,
marketing,
yeah.
everything. Like there's so many factors, but I don't think people are not seeing action movies. I think that they absolutely are. Like Godzilla v Kong is an action movie, made over 500 million. Doom Part 2, action movie, makes a lot of money. Like these are movies that people still go to. I do think when it comes to action movies and really just tentpoles in particular, the budgets for these movies aren't helping the scenarios at all. They're not helping the situation. There's no reason the Fall Guy should cost $150 million. Let's just keep it real and honest. It shouldn't cost that much. This is an unknown, unproven quantity. Why is it costing that much money? It shouldn't. That should be a $75 million movie at best. And if you produce it at that budget and you get a $150 million box office, now we're having a better conversation. We're like, okay, it's breaking even at least. Enough people went to go see it. Furiosa, I'm sorry, I love the movie. It shouldn't cost $168 million. Why does it cost that much money? First of all, the Mad Max franchise, it's not this global phenomenon. It's never been that. The Mad Max movies, they're cult movies. Like, they grew in reputation over time. Like, these are not massive 4-quadrant movies. Furiosa is rated R, so you already have a limited audience at that respect. And so the fact that they're giving it a budget that is equivalent to what we would see out of a Marvel or a DC movie or an animated picture that's meant to be 4-quadrant, it doesn't really make sense. And honestly, Fury Road, when it came out in 2015, financially was a modest success. It barely broke even. It didn't make all the money in the world. I think the only reason we even have this prequel film at this point is because of the critical success of Fury Road. The fact that so many people loved and revered it, and the fact that it got nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 6. So you could at least hang your hat on that and say, like, oh, well, this is a revered film that is seen as like a watershed moment for action movies. We can go ahead and justify the existence of another film. But if you do that, we got to scale back. We got to make it for less, because we already saw that people kind of showed up for Furiosa or for Fury Road, but not really. Like, it didn't do great at the box office. And so that just doesn't make sense, that thinking, to think that all of a sudden we're going to make money hand over fist with a prequel about a character that's a side character at that. And I said this weeks ago when we were doing our predictions, like, nobody asked for this in that respect, and nobody's just going to show up and pay money for a movie that they didn't even really understand why it existed to begin with. And so I think that that's really the starting point. These budgets have to be checked. We got to get them under control, because these are not performing in the way that they would think that they would, because these are mid-tier, B-level at best blockbuster movies. And we've just said that repeatedly on this podcast, talking about the releases in 2024. These are not Mission Impossible. These are not Marvel and DC tentpoles. These are not animated movies that are going to overperform like Super Mario Brothers. Like, these are just not in that same vein. And so I think that that's a huge problem that the studios have to face within themselves. Beyond that, there's other things to examine here too, and just like the movie going habits of people, how things have changed, and just, the choices that they are making, like what they are picking to go see. Because even if a movie is critically acclaimed, like a Furiosa, people still just don't show up for it. So I don't think that even the underperformance of these things is equivalent to the quality of them. Like, Furiosa has great responses. The Fall Guy has gotten pretty decent responses, and like, people just still didn't show up. So like, even the movies being good, quote unquote good, it's not enough. And that used to be a conversation point, like, well, the movie has to be good in first and foremost. Well, apparently not. Apparently that's not even enough anymore. Like, it doesn't get people out of their homes to go check this stuff out. And so what do you think about that as well? Just also, I guess, the moving target that exists. Like, at one moment, the movies, they have to be good to get people to go up, or maybe it has to be an original idea, or maybe it's something new, or maybe we actually are just, we're the same beings that we've always been. We want to go back to the places of comfort. We want to go back to the stuff that we know. We want the well-known things. We want the sequels, even though we say that we don't, but in actuality we do, because typically
really do.
That's what it feels like people only show up for at this place. So how do you feel about just like how things and the narrative, I think, just consistently shifts over time and really morphs and evolves?
Yeah, it's such a tricky thing. And, I think people's attitudes do come and go like the seasons, right? Just like exactly what we're talking about. And I think there are different waves of things we want to see versus things we don't. And like you said, it's like, oh, we want original. And then something will pop up like Barbenheimer, well, Barbie's not original, but you know what I mean, though? Like, two, at least, not proven ideas come along and they do great. And then there's like, okay, what about a proven idea? And it's like, we're not going to go see that. I don't know. Like you said, the target, it just kind of moves, and I can't figure out exactly why. But like you said, there's so many different factors. Like, was it the marketing? I don't. But the crazy thing about Furiosa is how bad it is. It's like in the ground to me. Like, how is it this bad? Like, this is really
because
really
it's
bad.
A prequel about a character that was a supporting character. That is why. Like, nobody goes to see stuff like that. Like, that just doesn't make sense. And again, Mad Max was already a franchise that was not this huge thing to be. That's not a $1 billion franchise. It's just not. Even the first 3 movies had modest budgets and made modest money at the box office. Like, the first 3 movies would cost like $15 million. I think the Road Warrior cost like $15 million in its time. Of course, it would be more now, but still $15 million. And then maybe it makes like 45 or 50 million at the box office. Like, these are not huge hits by any stretch of the. It's very similar, I think, to Blade Runner 2049. That movie tanked at the box office as well, because the original Blade Runner movie is not a crossover hit. It's a cult movie. That's a movie that grew over time in its reputation. It's obviously revered, and it's a watershed moment for science fiction films and dystopian films, but never was it this huge, massive success at the box office. And so to make a movie for $150 million, which I think the budget for that movie is, and to think that it's, going to make $500 million, that doesn't make sense. That just doesn't compute. Like, yes, it's well known, but I think sometimes studios confuse like hardcore film goers and hardcore film enthusiasts with the massive public audience. And those things can't be conflated. We can't conflate those things. We can't think that just because, Fury Road and Mad Max and all of these things have gotten all this critical acclaim over the course of a decade, we can't think that that's going to translate necessarily to hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. It doesn't necessarily work that way, especially considering the other factors like PVOD and streaming and those things, that have obviously come into play over the past few years.
At this, we just got to keep cranking out Jurassic Parks, bro. It's the only way
And
to
they
get
are,
people.
and they absolutely are. It's one on the way next year. Like we will only go a 3-year absence without it. Jurassic Park is on the way. Obviously, more Marvel is on the way. I mean, this is
Yeah.
this is the cycle that we're in, and people will
Mm-hmm.
complain and say like, oh well, why do we need a 10th Fast and Furious movie? That's the only movie
Because
y'all are paying for. That is the only
that's the
movie
only
that
one
y'all
y'all go
typically
see.
show up. Now, quality has dipped, and we see even with a big franchise like that, in the case of last year, when quality
Mm-hmm.
dips, people will stop showing up incrementally. When you see the Fast and
Mm.
Furious movies have gotten worse. Like, what the fuck is going on now? Like, now it's not $1 billion
Mm-hmm.
hit
Mm-hmm.
anymore. Now they're barely cracking 700 million. Or in the case of Mission Impossible, I mean that's also a timing thing, which is also important.
That's true.
Timing
That's a
is
timing
is
thing.
huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that movie comes out right before Barbenheimer, and that phenomenon just takes all the energy and the oxygen out of the room.
Mm-hmm.
So people kind of just forget about Mission Impossible. They forget about the big Tom Cruise tentpole. So it didn't get that momentum it probably would have gotten if it came out in a different weekend, which I think is another factor I want to ask you about, because Deadpool and Wolverine was supposed to come out in the weekend that the Fall Guy came out, but it got pushed back because of the strikes. It got pushed back to July, but it was going to open May 3rd, which traditionally Marvel movies do. They open in that first opening
Yeah.
weekend in May. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that as a moviegoer, if you show up to a Marvel movie, which you're probably going to get the most eyeballs, there's also a factor of momentum, right? Like, if you go to the Marvel
Mm-hmm.
movie and you see all of the coming attractions, you see the previews that play before the movie, you see like the rest of the summer movie slate, that gets you excited. Like, oh damn, I didn't even think about that movie, but maybe I'll show up to go check that movie out in June or July. Maybe I'll go check that out when it comes out in September or October. Sometimes even December. Sometimes these things are planned out even 7 or 8 months in advance. But we don't really have that. If nobody's going to see the Fall Guy, then they're probably not going to see the stuff that's going to come out in the next few months after that. So how do you feel like the timing also
Oh,
plays a factor
you are
into just
lost,
the whole
lost.
release strategy of these things and how they ultimately perform at the box office?
No, that's real because I think, we go to the movie so much. You know how, like, when I show up to the movies, I'm not always there at the beginning of the trailers just because we go to movies so much. I know I've seen these trailers like 18 times. And so, but what's funny is casual moviegoers are like, I've been to movies with friends before, and they're like, no, I really like the trailers. And you're like, oh, yeah, of course you do, because you might not have seen them. And so that's a very good point because exactly what you're saying. Like, if you don't show up for this big movie to see the trailers of what's coming up, that's another group of people who might not even know what's coming out, what it, what I mean, what the landscape is to show back up. I think that's a very, very interesting point, man. But even then, that's all pointing back to the weird marketing and things that happen within the Fall Guy that causes them not to go see that movie. But yeah, that's a crazy snowball effect and domino effect that I think needs to some of these studios need to be talking about now, because I know that's always been a big thing, especially when it comes to your own studio, right? We know when we go see Marvel movies, it's probably gonna be a bunch of Disney, and if Star Wars is on the horizon somewhere, and Star Wars things and Fox 20th Century Fox things. And if you don't do that, then it's almost like the whole studio is jacking up at that point. Like, it's almost like, even now more than ever, this one movie you put out might be more important than, like, you know what I mean, than some of the other things that are coming up. Like, people need to go watch this one movie. What are you going to do to get people there? And if you don't do that work, then there might not be any fruit for you later on down the line. And so I think that's something they have to talk about, and they're going to have to start figuring out in these big studios, again, who want these big budgets. Not only reduce the budget, but actually seriously consider how to get butts in seats. And it may have to go past Emily Blunt and Ryan Gosling are in the movie. It might have to go past that. You know what I mean? It needs to go past, well, maybe this title isn't working. Let's talk about that. You know what I mean? And it seems like maybe enough of that is being done. It's too much laziness, and I think too much over projection is happening. I think that's also been a thing that's been going on. Is some people, some studios, I think, have been giving themselves in a lot of ways too much credit about their ability to do such, their ability for people to go see a movie, their ability, because now they're like, oh, I don't know, a name's random studio. Oh, I'm Universal. Of course they're going to come see my movie. I'm only going to put in 70% of the work that I need for them to come see this movie. I've seen that before, or I felt that before. Like, oh, just because you're blah 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 doesn't mean so and so is going to come see your come see your film. So yeah, like, there's so much that goes into it, man. It's interesting.
So, um, let's talk about some of the reasons that this might be happening. You know, the just the decrease overall in movie going and movie interest at movie theaters in general.
Hmm.
We talk about this really all the time across the podcast. Like, well, why didn't this perform? Why didn't this do well? What are the reasons? And it's never just one
Hmm.
thing. I mean, there's just so many. There's myriad reasons as to why this has been the way that it's been, especially this year, just considering like how poorly things are going. Again, want to emphasize we have expected this to a certain degree, because there's just a lack of huge tent poles coming out this year. There's the lack of the Marvel tent pole in the first May opening weekend. There's the lack of just the amount of titles that are coming out as well. Like Disney has only put out 2 movies this year up until this point. One of them was Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which did decent in its opening weekend and still doing decent. And the other one was The First Omen, which came out in April, which nobody
Hmm.
saw. Typically by this time, Disney would have a lot of movies already out. They would have their smaller plays from their other studios, but we would probably
Hmm.
have already at this point a big Marvel movie out. We would have had a spring Disney live action release that probably would have come out. Their June Pixar movie is on the horizon. That's going to be Inside Out too. So Help is on the way, but they haven't even released a ton of pictures this year, and so that's also
Hmm.
just the quantity element that comes into the play. But I think first and foremost, like streaming and premium video on demand, PVOD, how that is obviously affecting things. Of course, we have been trained to exhibit certain behaviors over the past few years. And once that toothpaste is out of the bottle, there's really no putting it back in. And I think that that's been the case that we've seen first and foremost. Streaming and PVOD and just the availability of movies within a very, very
Yeah.
limited time frame has just changed the habits of people. They expect and understand and know I can wait just a few weeks probably now, and I'll see the movie if I really want to see it. I'll either pay for it or I'll just wait until it hits streaming just a few months later. And that's interesting to me because there are still certain movies that people rush out to see. There's certain movies that people don't wait for. They're becoming few and far in between. But what are your thoughts just about streaming and PVOD and how that's affected things? Because I think all of this just really took shape after COVID. COVID just changed everything. The
Mm.
theatrical window got just extremely shrunken at that point because studios just needed cash flow. They needed money to come in. But now, again, once you open that can of worms, it's no going back. And so now there's just, I think, an adjustment period where maybe there's just only a few movies every year that have this massive amount of success. But it's
Hmm.
also kind of confusing sometimes because you'll get your out of nowhere success hit like Wonka that comes out and just makes so much money. When it
Mm.
comes out, it's like, well,
Hmm.
why is Wonka working? I mean, that's
Hmm.
an IP, of course, but it's also one of those it's also one of those film series that hasn't like been super super popular. Like Wonka worked.
Right.
It's a prequel about a character,
It is a prequel.
right? But Furiosa
Yeah.
does not. I mean, how do we rectify that? And what, I guess, what role does streaming and premium video on demand maybe play into the performance or lack thereof of a movie in theaters?
Yeah, we're creatures of habit, man. And you said it during COVID. That was the only way to view movies. We still, I still always think about the Wonder Woman 84 slash, what's the Pixar movie that came out? Soul,
So
the
yeah.
Soul kind of moment, because that was like the time I was like, wow, we're really not going to the movies. Like we're all going to sit at home and watch a Pixar movie and a DCEU film from the comforts of our home, like the premiere. And I thought that was so crazy. But now moving outside of that, knowing because again, part of this is I think on a release schedule, right? To the fault of the release schedule of PVOD and streaming. Fall Guy was out like what, like a week after went in theaters no more,
It's
two
well,
weeks after went in.
17 days, because that's
It
that's
was
Universal's mandate post COVID. If a movie doesn't crack 50 million in the opening weekend, 17 days
17
on
days.
PVOD. So yeah.
That is insane. That is crazy. And that doesn't feel super healthy either, right? Because now there feels like zero urgency to go to a movie theater. Why, if there is a film that I know I can see 17 days after it's in theaters, if it doesn't do well, like you said, it doesn't do well. Even if it does do well, some of the best movies now like be like 90 days. You know what I'm saying? That's not that long in the grand scheme of things. It's still within the year. You're not really, somebody could be talking about, oh, this movie is great and so and so, and you're like, oh, I'll just wait. It's only 2.5 months, 3 months later, and now you've seen it too from the comfort of your home. You didn't have to spend the money. You only used the money for streaming, it's a weird situation, I think, to be in, and I think people are just comfortable in that way. Why go spend the from $12 to $30 to buy a ticket when I'll just wait a couple months and almost get the same experience? And I think that sense of urgency between that time it takes to get on streaming and the sense of urgency to go to a theater is just not there anymore, man. And it's a very weird predicament to be in.
So why do movies like Dune, Barbie, Oppenheimer, Maverick,
Mm-hmm.
what was it about those that created that sense of urgency? Why were those the movies that people showed up to instantly, immediately, as opposed to some of the failures that we've seen recently?
I think what all those particular IPs have in common is a long sense of fandom that some of these other things don't have. Top Gun, like you said, that was more culty, right? Top Gun, but like over time, people just really love Top Gun, and I think it was like Top Gun and Tom Cruise, and that was we talk about that. That was like one of our returns from COVID. Like, oh shit, we got to go see Top Gun. That was the thing. Barbie in particular, Barbie, one of the biggest selling toys we've ever had in the world. Really long, thing of fandom, really long history of fandom. And I think maybe some of these movies just don't have that. You literally just said that about Mad Max. It was culty. Mad Max is super culty. It wasn't on the level of Barbie. It wasn't. I know more people for sure. If you go down the line, do you know what Top Gun is? More people gonna know what Top Gun is than they know what they seen the first Mad Max or even Road Warrior. I think that's really it, man. It's those levels of fandom. People know Marvel. People have been, you know what I mean? That's different now. All of that stuff is just on a different level than some of these I think particular other IPs are. And maybe that's the misconception of these budgets too. Maybe I don't know where they would have got this from, this statistics from, but Mad Max, like you said, wasn't on that level. It never has been one of those franchises. But I don't know, man. I think that's the only common thread I can find is they had previous fandoms that spanned it almost all the things we're talking about, like 30 years. You know what I'm saying? Like 30 plus years. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I do think obviously history association will take you. I think it will take you, but so far. I think what takes
Mm-hmm.
all of those things a step further. Barbie literally created a moment that was not only tied to the fandom and the history and the lineage of the brand,
Mm-hmm.
but the now and the immediacy and the cultural
Mm.
moment and what it felt like to be a part of something that's of the now.
Yeah.
That movie doesn't make $1.5 billion just based off the name. It just doesn't, because if it's a cookie
Mm-hmm.
cutter ordinary Barbie movie where a lot of people have already disassociated from that brand, nobody shows up for it in that way. But because
Absolutely.
it subverted expectations, it created a new fandom around it. It created the costumes and the cosplay and the music and the soundtrack and the world that you can latch
Mm-hmm.
on to even before you've even seen the movie. And a lot of that is based off of the IP itself. They have just so much to pull from. It creates this moment that you can now be a part of and just urges people to want to go see it. And
Mm-hmm.
you still have to wonder, well, Oppenheimer still made a lot of fucking money. It almost made $1 billion in
It did.
itself, about a scientist and the creation of the atomic bomb. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't make sense, and much of that is buoyed by the success of Barbie. It's certainly, I wouldn't say it rode its coattails, but it obviously benefited from just the
Right. For
simultaneous
sure.
release. But even that is like, yo, Christopher Nolan's name, does it carry that much weight? Maybe it does. Maybe that's one of the things that helps people feel
Mm-hmm.
confident to go see something that they think is at least going to be worth it, or just the dichotomy and the difference between these two. Again, that's just such a
Mm-hmm.
singular experience, but I think either other examples, like, again, going back to the prequel conversation we saw with Furiosa, what happened. I think we saw a similar thing with Lightyear that came out a couple of years ago. Like, nobody's
Mm-hmm.
interested in Buzz Lightyear's origin story. Like, period. Like, not even kids want to see that. They want to see Toy Story, which is why we're getting another Toy Story. Like, that's exactly why that's
Right.
happening. Bob Iger has pretty much
Mm-hmm.
confirmed that. Nobody wanted to see Solo. Nobody wanted to see not
Mm-hmm.
Harrison Ford be a young Solo. We want Harrison Ford as
Looking forward
Solo.
to be
And
so.
that pretty much
Mm-hmm.
made Lucasfilm gun shy in the past 5 years to make any movie, which is just kind of crazy to me because that movie tanked in the big way that it did. So I think the decisions, it boils down a lot to, yes, budgets have to be put in check, but then also with this
Mm-hmm.
streaming PVOD conversation, man, it's tough just because you do have this new expectation of movies coming out almost immediately and not having to wait for
Mm-hmm.
them. I still think 3 months is super respectable. Like that's still like
Yeah, I think so.
that's more than enough time. Like a movie's gonna make most of its money in the first two to three opening weekends anyway. But
Absolutely.
3 months feels like a great standard to hold. I mean, we saw how that worked for Top Gun. They held it in theaters. They didn't put it on streaming or physical media for like 6 months. Same thing with Oppenheimer, but these are also coming from filmmakers who wield that type of power, Chris Nolan and Tom Cruise.
That's true.
They can go to the negotiating table and say, you're not fucking putting my movie on streaming in a month, bro. It's not happening. Like Chris Nolan's like, fuck that. I'll go to another studio because we saw what happened at Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
But that's a very rare case that can be made. We can't absolve movie theaters in this whole conversation as well either, though, right? Because movie theaters are more expensive. Tickets have only gone up in terms of pricing. The average ticket price right now is like hovering around $10. If you go back to even pre-pandemic times, it was a little bit under $8 or a little bit under $9, I should say. So it's already risen in the 5 years since then. But then also the movie theater experience, like theaters aren't like great to go to. I guess, like, if we're being real about it, it's not the greatest place to be unless you're paying like premium prices for Alamo Drafthouse. Movie theater etiquette, you show up, people are texting, talking. You go to some theaters that maybe haven't been updated. They're dirty as fuck. You go to the bathrooms. It's like, what is this? Screens and bulbs aren't up to snuff. The premium experience just doesn't feel like it's there. So to your point earlier, some folks have like amazing home theater setups, and they're like, yo, I'm not about to go out to this trashy Regal theater when I could just wait a few weeks, and I got surround sound, I got 4K streaming, I can set up my own system, and I don't have to pay all the money. The movie theater itself experience, the physical experience of the facilities, I think for a lot of people isn't also up to snuff because of all these distractions and the etiquette, the lack thereof, and just the quality of the theaters. What do you make of that? I mean, we go to so many theaters all the time. We see this in real time, like. There's some theaters I'm like, I'm avoiding that place. I'm not going there.
I'm not going
I would just rather not see the movie until I can see it at home. I even suffer from that at times. So how do you feel about just that also playing a part of this conversation and equation overall?
Yeah, I think it's important. And I think, that's what the now competing theaters are trying to, I don't know if get together is the word, but that is something I think they argue. Like Regal was like, look at this. I forgot what movie we went to see. I think it was The Killer. I think we went to a Regal to see The Killer. Was that a Regal?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
I think it was a Regal to see The Killer. And I was like, this place is really nice. I remember being like, what is this? Like, do all the Regals in New York look like this? Like, I was really like so surprised that it looked this nice, because it really did feel different from the AMCs that we go to. And part of me wondered, was it the comfortability of AMC to be like that? Or like, it's really hard to shut down a movie theater to upgrade it.
Yeah.
Because then you're out of theaters for a certain amount of time. You know what I'm saying? It's so hard, I feel like, to upgrade a movie theater, because as soon as you're closed, you're missing out on your business. So it's like, how do you upgrade them? I think that's like a whole different issue, but that's really real. But movie theater costs it's a real thing. What's interesting, I remember seeing something, this was a couple years ago, so it could be off, but I remember seeing something that if you adjust for inflation, really, we're only like $1 off. The average movie ticket's only like $1 off from where it would be. Really, movie tickets is exactly where they should be. Of course, New York, we pay way too much for movie tickets. I mean, our premium theater is like, if we didn't have A-list, it would be like $30 for our IMAX. It's kind of insane.
Yeah.
But you think about a normal place, let's say Kansas City. I go to a lot of movies in Kansas City, is where I'm from. The ticket prices are normal, like $13-$14, to see a movie. And that might be almost close to premium, if not a normal theater. And so it's like, why? I think it is that experience part, because you do have to drive there. That takes gas. And then we talk about all the time the concessions, and concessions is a whole thing within itself, especially when you talk about families and people who want to go to the movies with their families. Now, a family of 5, you got to multiply the $16 by the 5 people seeing the movie, add concessions to each person. Lily want a popcorn. Thomas wants a icy plus some Skittles.
Yeah, all the fucking fixings in that theater.
All the fixings. And now just to see Despicable Me 4, which is going to make hella money, which Despicable Me 4, now you done spend $150 just for your team of, or your family of 4 or 5 just to go to the movies. It's crazy. But it definitely plays a factor. And in fact, talking to a lot of people, when I tell them about A-list, they do perk up like, huh? like I'm still telling people about A-list to this day. Like I don't people still really don't know, but it is like a realization of like, oh, that's all it costs to go to the movies now to do this. People still don't know that, and part of me thinks if they knew how easy going it was, how much me and you pay monthly for A-list to go see all the movies we go see, they would be. I think more people would do that, but people are still they still don't know about those prices. They don't know about those subscription services and ways you can make them going to the movies cheaper. So yeah, I think movie theater costs it's definitely a whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's only but so much money that people have, especially now. Like inflation and prices and the economics of our country right now are in a very,
It's
very tough
terrible.
spot. Like it's really bad.
Mm-hmm.
People just don't have excessive money to be spending on luxuries. Going to the movies is a luxury.
Mm-hmm.
Like we are fortunate because we do subscribe to that, but you have to sacrifice things. And if you're already paying premium for Netflix, maybe you're $15.99 and then maybe one or two other streaming services. Now you want to pay an additional fee for a movie to go see in theaters, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe the movie's good, maybe it's not, and that's not accounting for other people that I might have to take, my wife, kids, husband, whatever the case may
Mm-hmm.
be. That becomes just an easy choice, I think, for a lot of people to make, to just say like, I no, because I know it's going to be here pretty soon, so I just got to hold out for a few weeks,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a month or two, or whatever the case may be. I'm willing to do that to save this money that I have, this limited amount of money that I have. And two, if I go to the movies, it's probably not going to be a great experience because the place is dirty and the food is overpriced and there's people
Mm-hmm.
talking and there's people on their phone and all this extra shit that I just don't want to deal with. I could just be at the crib and just shack up on my
Where I pay
couch
rent.
where I pay rent and just stay here and watch the damn movie.
Want
Like
to be here? Yeah.
exactly. So like all of that stuff is just a major thing. And so I'm, a part of that onus does have to be placed on theaters, and just the fact that like we aren't
Yeah.
regulating these experiences to be the best that they can be. I mean, Alamo Drafthouse does the best job at this, at making going to
Mm-hmm.
the movies feel special. I love when I go to Alamo. It's not often because I don't subscribe to their service, but when I do, I make it a special thing because their facilities are
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Their customer service is great. Their concessions and their food is premium. You get real food there, and they enforce their rules. If people are talking and texting, all I got to do is hit a button. Get the fuck out of here, bro. Like you can't just be talking during the movie. Like that's not what we're here for. Because I just don't understand. That's another thing I don't understand. Like excessive talking and using, like people that
Yeah.
do it excessively. Like, so you paid
Mm-hmm.
to be here. You paid all this money, and now you're not even
And not
watching the
even
movie.
watching it.
That
Mm-hmm.
blows my mind. Like it's one thing to do a couple
Yeah.
checks here and there, but we see it sometimes. Like people, they got their brightness all the
Mm-hmm.
way up. It's like, yo, bro, what are,
It's like, all right,
what
dog.
are you doing? So a part of the onus does have to be placed on them. But to your point earlier, to shut down a theater for months at a time to upgrade it, to give you that premium experience,
It's
that's
hard.
hard. You got to be making money to do that. You got to be in a comfortable place. And most of these theaters, especially AMC, they're not in a place to do that. They're still losing money, and they still have to depend on next year to save them. I remember when
Mm-hmm.
remember that Dolby shut down at Lincoln Square. I mean, it was gone for like
Yeah.
6 months, like
It was
six
a
or 7 months.
long
It was a
time.
long time to get it up to
Mm-hmm.
snuff. And even the AMC Lincoln Square IMAX, I remember a few years ago that shut down for like minor
Mm-hmm.
refurbishments, minor
Upgrading
repairs,
seats
upgraded
and
seats,
yeah.
and probably
Mm-hmm.
fixed the sound system, the screen. They probably
Mm-hmm.
did all of that stuff, but that was like a month. It was gone, and that was like, oh man, this is really tough right now. Like we don't have
Yeah.
access to this, so it becomes just a really treacherous circle that we get into. But I guess help is on the way. We do have Inside Out 2 coming out. We do have Despicable Me 4, as you mentioned. Deadpool and Wolverine, that has become, like the highest earner for
Hey.
pre-sale tickets for a rated R movie. I mean, even if we look at the rest of the year, there's some potential big hits there. Wicked
Absolutely.
Wicked could be huge, coming out in
Wicked
November.
could be big. Mm-hmm.
Moana 2 will be huge. That's gonna
Oh,
be
it's no
that's
question.
gonna be
It's going to be
big.
like 1.5 bill.
Yeah, it's gonna
Like
it's gonna be it's
crazy.
gonna be pretty ridiculous. So it feels like help is on the way. It feels like that this doom and gloom conversation might not last that long, but I do think that overall,
Mm-hmm.
like the year will be down compared to last year. I don't think there's any way around that, even with those successes. But do you think that there's enough there to, I guess, to stop the bleeding? Like there's a few hits, they're few and far in between, but the reason I ask that is because I'll use Challengers as an example. You know, that movie,
Mm-hmm.
it's close to 100 mil, you know, right now. I think it's sitting at like 90 million. That's an original idea with the star in front of
That's
it,
good.
Zendaya, one of the most popular stars. But for it to make $90 million, that's pretty good. You know,
That's pretty
that's
good.
pretty decent
Mm-hmm.
for this movie that doesn't really have anything behind it besides its lead star. I think in former years, we would get more of those. We would get a lot more of those. And so even in between the huge
Mm.
tempos, you would get those base hits. Those, I talk about that all the time, just having base hits that do okay, you know. But now
Right.
we're getting fewer and fewer of those. We're getting less of those movies that just do okay, or they do okay compared to their budgets. So just with the lack of those movies available, and also just with the lack of tent poles available for this year, even though there are a few on the way, do you think that
Mm-hmm.
like we're still in for some very, very tough days ahead in 2024? Or could movies like Despicable Me, Deadpool, you know, and Wolverine, Inside Out, could those movies maybe give it the jolt of energy that we're hoping for, that we need for theaters to be able, I think, to at least like crawl to the finish line and to get into 2025 where it feels like that there's a lot more big films that are going to be on the way.
Yeah, I think in terms of this year for sure. I really do believe in those movies still, even what again, Furiosa and Fall Guy feels so different compared to those. And part of it is like that IP feel of it all. Like Pixar is way different, you know what I'm saying, than what Mad Max is gonna be. Despicable Me is different than what Mad Max is. And of course Deadpool Wolverine. We just know that movie's going to make money. And even so, I am more interested kind of in those base hits. Is Kinds of Kindness going to be a base hit? Is the Bike Riders going to be a base hit? Is you know what I
That's a
mean?
prime movie that should be a base hit. Like makes just enough money, enough people see it, but it's a good success
Exactly.
because it doesn't cost a ton to make. Right?
Exactly. And I think that's part of our conversation is we should have felt how we feel about those movies about the Fall Guy. Maybe we should have been thinking about Fall Guys. We just needed to be a base hit, but their budget was so ridiculous they could never hit a base hit. You got to hit it out the park, and that was you couldn't do that. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like it was unrealistic to do that. And so yeah, I think that's a full circle of like it was just doing too much. And there's other movies I think that have more realistic expectations than what Furiosa and the Fall Guy had. And so yeah, I think that's it, man.
Yeah, I think, you know, we got a couple of really, really huge films on the way. Obviously, I'm expecting a lot from Inside Out. Obviously, Despicable Me and Deadpool and Wolverine. They will be okay. They will be more than okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's some of those in betweens where it's like this could go well or this could maybe not go so well. What is
Mm-hmm.
Beetlejuice gonna do? You know,
I'm so
that's
curious. I
another
have no
yeah, that's
idea.
another cult like movie that developed a big rabid fan base over time and over history because of cable and rentals and re-releases and stuff like that. But is it going to be this huge hit? Like, I don't know. You know, that could or could not be. Maybe the star power of Jenna Ortega is enough. Maybe that momentum from Wednesday can
Mm-hmm.
carry over. But that's also possibly a fool's game because again, just because something is successful because this person was in it on streaming doesn't mean that people are going to show up and pay money at the movie theater. Like these are
Absolutely.
two different things. So I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
about Beetlejuice. I'm curious about Wicked. You know, we've seen the struggles of musicals and Broadway shows adapted to live action. Like they just mostly
Mm-hmm.
don't work. They don't really play. What
Mm-hmm.
is Borderlands going to do? Video game adaptations have had a little bit more success lately. So is that going to be able to play to a wider audience?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a Five Nights at Freddy's situation. That was a huge hit last year. You know,
It was.
Deadline put that on their most valuable blockbusters because of the budget was so low and it made a ton of money. The return on investment, extraordinary. So there are some interesting plays here from the studios, things that I think can work in their favor if marketed well, if they get the fandoms and the urgency there to get people to want to go see them. But I try to remain optimistic about the experience. I think that movie theaters obviously have still a cultural significance that most other mediums don't have. You know, I think it's a very rare place where something, if it's good, if enough people go see it, can catch fire and become a phenomenon in ways that other mediums just don't always showcase. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, you know, I think the reason that temp holes are so important and they do need to exist is because if you think about it, from the streaming perspective, from what we've gotten out of, you know, really, I think 15 years of streaming, there isn't any IP originally created for streaming that has spun out into massive merchandising opportunities, other spin-offs and theme parks and other ways to really license out and become like big phenomenons. Like only films
Yeah.
still do that. Like there's no streaming original
Mm-hmm.
created property that's done that. Maybe Stranger Things has the most potential to
Maybe
do
Stranger
that.
Things.
Maybe,
Yeah.
but if
Mm-hmm.
you really think about everything like a Harry Potter, a Toy Story, Marvel, these huge franchises that have all the other opportunities, all the other business levers
Mm-hmm.
that they can pull from merchandise and theme parks and toys and sponsorships and brand partnerships, whatever the case may be, it's all from movies. It's all from movies, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So you need these things to still create these things that are going to be super popular, crossover hits, crossover successes that can resonate for a generation, for multiple years at a time. Because at the end of the day, streaming is not doing that. So you know, I got to disagree with what Netflix just said. They said that movies on Netflix are cinema quality. No, they're not. They're just not. They are absolutely not. I think at this point, it's pretty clear to me they are glorified TV movies. That's how I feel. You
That's
know,
what
I
they
think I
are.
think that
I've always felt
I
that
think that
way.
they're glorified
I've
TV
always felt
movies
that.
because
Yeah.
we're not creating franchises, we're not creating worlds, we're not creating moments and movements
Mm-hmm.
and things based off of these streaming movies. And so I think that we need these big hits to come. We need movie theaters to still be successful and survive and hopefully pave the way for all of the entertainment that we can hopefully enjoy. Otherwise, we're going to be losing out on a pretty valuable resource, a pretty valuable thing that I think we can still connect on in terms of, being a community of people that go to see certain things. But we'll have to see. We'll continue this conversation as the summer season continues to develop. But